Matt, tell me, did you watch the game on the weekend live, or did you tune in after a coffee and a bacon and egg roll?
I did. I delayed my watching, so I got up still early, and I put on both games, left the phone in the room, and made a few coffees, and it was all looking good for good old 43 minutes.
So you didn't, you weren't tempted to look at the headlines before you watched the TV?
No, well, of course you're tempted, but I set structures in place, mate, to get me out of the way, and I left the phone on, and then I'm glad I didn't go near it because, there was a few texts, as you can imagine, a few alerts.
Well, at one point in time, it was looking all rosy when it was 20-3 after 29 minutes. But blimey, didn't it change very, very quickly? So, look, a record defeat for the Wallabies. We're going to be breaking down what went wrong, and we'll turn our attention to the Bledisloe Cup, which is quickly coming up, less than 2 weeks before that encounter in Sydney at the Olympic Stadium. And also a really special guest, a man seeking to become the first Australian to be World Rugby chairman, Brett Robinson. So a lot coming up on the World Rugby podcast. All right, Matt, please tell me how to solve Australian rugby's problems, because for a lot of people, a 67-27 result, when you're waking up and you're halfway through your coffee and then you see what happened then, if you tuned in midway through that second half, you quite possibly would have spat that coffee out in disbelief.
Yeah, well, would never spit out a 2 before 10 coffee. But no, look, I am doing marketing stuff at the moment. But look, we had 4 halves in South America, and 3 of them were really good, and 1 was awful. And I know it's brutal because it's the worst loss and all this, but we won a game over there, which I honestly didn't think we would, and we led at halftime in another one. I know I'm cherry picking, but this is a team that's building. We won 3 tests at the start of the year that we, thought that's a good start. The Box are the Box, and then we got up against the Argies, and then we started really well again. And so, I think there is some really good positive signs there. I think that second half of the second test was very much a sign of inexperience. Compounding errors, and then just the emotional toll that took on the team. So you wouldn't say to be expected, but in a weird way, understandable considering the kind of life cycle of our team at the moment.
If you had said at the start of the year you would be 4 from 7 leading into the Bledisloe, you probably almost take that.
You would. You're mad if you wouldn't, or you're delusional about where the game currently is. Like no perfectionist or aspirationist would say 4 from 7 is awesome, but anyone who's been watching the game closely and understanding where we're at and how long it actually takes to build a strong, cohesive team would understand that it takes time. So, look, there would have been a lot spoken about on the weekend about the fast start, particularly with the Argentinians, and taking the emotional element away from the game, particularly in Montoya's 100th test and after the win, and they did that. They did that really, really well. You heard on the comms Michael Hooper talking about that. Unfortunately, they had a plan B, the Argies, and they're a bit more developed than maybe they were 12 years ago when it was just that emotional start that you had to worry about. They had a lot more to it. It was disappointing in that sense. But I think I'm very circumspect in realizing that, we had 4 halves over there. 3 were very good. 1 was to forget.
One was certainly to forget. Let's talk about some of the positives, perhaps to begin with. When you're 20 points to 3 up, then Donaldson decides to go down the short side and frees up a bit of a mismatch or an overlap on the blind side, and it was really well executed from Ikitau to Kellaway to Jorgensen back on the inside to Kellaway to score. That's probably some of the best rugby that the Wallabies had played from an attack point of view, would you say?
Yeah, I've seen there's been 2 plays now. I think there was a 50-22 off the centre field scrum.
In Perth.
They did that. Yeah, they did that kind of little riff-raff play, and then they did the same thing there, really manipulating the backfield, which I didn't know riff-raff was. I only heard it on the comms as well. It was after old Alan Gaffney.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I've been calling it riff-raff for 20 years or whatever, so that was really cool. But yeah, you've seen elements layered in there of Joe and his kind of tactical nous, which is really cool. And I think primarily the Wallabies have built their game on this, from base up, very much around breakdown. You're seeing Laurie Fisher in there, and then every now and then you get a little bit of Joe Schmidt where it kind of gets guys excited. So I think that's really cool. It's really tactical, thought out play, stuff that during the early 2000s we were very much known for.
Okay, so what else were you impressed by in that first? How did we get to the point where we were 20-3 up in that first half? Was it the go forward from Bell and Tupou and the strong carries first up from Jeremy Williams of the kick restarts, or how did we get ourselves in the position that we thought, hang on a moment, this is the Joe Schmidt coached Wallaby side we somewhat expected, maybe not to happen immediately, but to happen pretty soon on a dry track after 2 really wet, torrid test matches.
Yeah, and look, I think really good points you bring up, and really good examples of players who really stood up, particularly Bell. I thought he was exceptional. But I thought defensively, once again, I thought if you're building the game from your ground up, and we talk about breakdown, defensively, I thought they looked really, really strong. Well connected, a good line, not necessarily crazy line speed, but just a well-connected, strong team, hitting low, chopping guys, which is important over there because they like to get their offload in, and if you can deck early and get some ball pressure, it helps. So, yeah, look, I think this team's really benefited when we've had some ball runners, and whilst Lucan was missed, it was good to see Williams do quite well. But I think we're at our best when we do have, a lot of ball runners in that forward pack, and potentially, in the back line, whether it be a strong running centre or a bigger winger. But yeah, there's some good signs there. I don't know about you. Like, it was, at half time, although they dropped the ball over the line just before half, you started going, we're in this, and and it was in a weird way surprising, because I thought it would have been the other way around. I thought it would have been they would have started strong and we would have come back later. So, yeah, an interesting game.
We probably saw there's parts of the bench which are really experienced with Alatella and Slipper, but then there's inexperience elsewhere. And it was just how the balancing act worked out that it turned out to be a dreadful outcome. I thought the changing moment was in the 31st minute when Gordon's clearing kick, box kick, it looked like being almost inch perfect, but you saw the fullback, Juan Cruz Malia, what he did by jumping back on the inside of the play of the field, passing to his fly half, then taking the up and under, and then unleashing and getting a really quick early ball for Pablo Matera to then allow to free his winger Carreras up. That was just an immediate hit back and almost just shocked the Wallabies, I think. And they had their tails up from that point in time. It was an amazing response, and it kind of showed the up-tempo nature that Argentina wanted to play with.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, you felt it. You felt a little momentum shift. And I thought halftime came at a perfect point for us, particularly with the disallowed try, that we go back in there going, all right, we can stem the flow here, get our systems in place, and start that half again a little bit, and do what we did well in the first half. Unfortunately, it didn't pan out that way. But like I said, there were some really good building blocks. But yeah, just some phenomenal skill. And by the end, no team's beating that Argentinian team the way they're playing. But I think if the team had some more experience in there, once again, it's so hard, and we've all been there, but if you have more experience, you learn ways to change momentum, or at least halt momentum, whether it be kicking for touch, walking to line outs, this kind of thing, or putting a lot more on ball pressure, and actually potentially going on the wrong side of the penalty count but not allowing the offloads. There's ways that you can maybe influence the momentum side of things, and unfortunately, we just didn't have that. So, yeah, obviously disappointing, but yeah.
I said in the instant reaction with Tony Harper, 17 offloads to 2 or 17 offloads to 3 in the end. Like, that told a story. And when you're freeing your arms and creating that much second phase ball, like, it's hard to stop. And that says a little bit about not being able to contain them defensively. And then I did think that in the last 10, 15 minutes, I don't know if you can say that they gave up, but they certainly that they weren't tracking on the inside, and that became pretty obvious. They were completely gassed.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's just moral devastation or whatever at that point. It's like the guys will watch the tape and they won't even remember those bits. To be honest, it's not like, yeah, it's giving up in that sense, but it's been defeated more than anything. It's just been completely and utterly defeated at that point. So, yeah, and the offloads is a really good point. It was really obvious, I guess. There was times where the offloads were obvious because they've dominated contact and it was just an outcome of, poor tackling. And there were times when it was just momentum, just flicking it up off the deck and knowing someone's coming in there. And, that's quite hard to stop. And that's kind of what I mean about slowing the ball and maybe getting at risk of getting a penalty just because you know that these guys are gonna do that. And you look at the highlights and, there's these wide plays and it looks really good, but it's often these guys just, similar to the French, they play in and around that ruck, and that's where they dominate it there. They get the offloads and then they spread it wide, and it can be a little bit of fool's gold, thinking that you've got to cover the width of the game.
Well, look, I'm sure you're not going to come out and criticise some of your teammates or old teammates like the Alan Alatoas, the James Slippers. They would be disappointed by how they fronted up the scrum. They early in that second half, they were fresh. They struggled. That's a concern off the back of the Brumbies struggling in that area this year as well. No Dan Palmer. You hope that Dan can, he worked so closely with those guys in previous years. He wasn't there this year. Alatoa coming off the back of an Achilles. Obviously, Slips is getting on. But it is concerning that those two guys are the most experienced and they struggled so much there. But the other area, you look at that back line at the moment, they're very small. And we've spoken in the past about guys like Tom Liner probably physically not quite being there yet from an international perspective. There was a moment late in that second half where I thought, that sums up where this team's at the moment. And I can't understand the decision to turn away from guys and not prioritise re-signing guys like Nwanganitawasi, the Jordan Bataillas, the Karevis, who are obviously long gone. But you had Max Jorgensen carrying the ball into the teeth of the defence and then getting smoked in contact, and the only person there to try to clean out was Tom Liner. And Tom Liner's not going to be able to sustain the pressure of someone coming in really hard. And that was the concern for me. Hamish Stewart's really pretty small. Jorgensen, Kellaway, even Corabetti, hard as nails, but they're not big. They don't offer anything in the air, really. They're not going to be able to contest. It just looks a bit samey, the back line, to me.
Yeah, and then you I think back to a couple, when I played, when we were quite fortunate in the back lines, we had you'd still have the dual playmaker, say 10-12, but we often would have a really big winger, that would kind of get you go forward first phase, whether it be at the time Joe Tamane or Henry Spate, Tangele Nayavoro, we had these kind of bigger bodies, older bodies.
Yeah, Kirajani at outside centre for a long time.
Outside, and so that helped a little bit. I think, we're a bit young ultimately, and I think that's why we have benefited when we've had ball runners in the pack, because it's probably more of a realistic, tactical way to go about it in getting your Taniellas and your Lucans, your Bobby V's out in the back line early, and your Harry Wilsons, because that way you've got 4 or 5 runners, which maybe we don't have in the backs at the moment. We have good ball movement, but probably not the kind of the carrying nous or the carrying ability that we used to. And I think it's an evolution that clearly, Jordan Petaia looks amazing at the moment, carrying off the wing, or at 13, just getting a little bit of a bigger body there. But yeah, it's just the kind of the cycle that we're in at the moment, where we're a little bit young, and I think we're kind of making up for it in the pack. And maybe that we suffer set piece because of that. I don't really know enough about that stuff, but yeah, it's interesting how we go about this coaching kind of how we go about it tactically, I think.
All right, let's turn our attention to the Bledisloe Cup. It's not too far away. We're not going to necessarily go straight into the game itself and how it's going to play out, but there's going to be a new squad that's announced towards the end of the week. Imagine someone like a Fraser McWright will come immediately back. I think he's fit. Lean Wright, another one who I imagine. Brandon Paenga-Mosa, he's a guy that can offer something from a scrum set piece point of view that could help out the likes of Alatoa and Slipper. But is there anyone else that you'd like to see come back into the mix, or can we not really turn to anyone else because we've actually let so many of the guys who are experienced, like the Hannigans and the Swintons, we've already let them go to go overseas?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think, before going on, probably after being quite critical, it was clear how devastated the guys were and how much, as much as we were feeling it here, I know for a fact, after speaking to a couple of guys at how quiet that change room was, so these guys are trying their hardest. It's like I said, it's a little bit of the life cycle that we're currently in. But look, in terms of guys coming in, I think of a guy like Jordan Wasiliev, not the straightest throw of a line out, but God, he can hold up a scrum. And you wonder, it's a bit difficult. I wasn't as concerned during the year as you had raised about the scrum, particularly the Brumbies, but clearly you were spot on, because it has kind of transferred over to the Wallabies a little bit, which these are guys who we know have the capability to scrum well. So maybe there's a shift of focus or something else. I'm not sure, but look, I'm not sure we have too many other options. You know what I mean? Like once again, unless we change the rule from selecting from overseas, I think it's very much a we're going to be building with what we've got.
Well, my understanding still on that is that Joe Schmidt, he's the person that is prioritising looking inwards. I think the RA board would certainly try to change and to try to get players back from overseas if Schmidt wanted it. But he's come from an area, and he's come from Ireland, he's come from New Zealand, where they pick pretty much exclusively from home, and that's worked from in the past. So, it's we'll find out a bit more over the next couple of weeks as to whether or not it's going to work, but it's tough, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a little bit selective as well. South Africa have picked from overseas, and that's worked as well. And they had a previous policy which they altered, and it significantly impacted their fortunes. I don't think we'll quite have that impact, but I think to ignore it would be a little bit naive.
All right, we're going to talk more about the box and the ABs in a little while, and we'll do that after this interview, because joining us right now is Dr. Brett Robinson. Another very special guest here on the World Rugby podcast, a man very familiar to Australian audiences and perhaps going to be very familiar to World Rugby audiences as well. It's former Wallaby Brett Robinson. Brett, thanks for coming on the pod.
Thanks, Christy. Thanks, Maddie, for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
I was going to say, Brett, how well do you guys know each other? Because you have the Brett Robinson medal down at the Brumbies. Unfortunately, you never got to shake Matt Tamua's hand and pass him one.
Yeah, I got to shake his hand a lot, and I was really, as a custodian of the culture of the Brumbies, Matty was a pretty special leader down there. So he may not have won the award, but he certainly understood his responsibilities there and took them pretty seriously. So, he was sitting in front of a guy called George Smith and David Pocock, and there were a few other guys around that were pretty good. I mean, I had to get the hell out of there when George turned up. I wouldn't have even been a starting member.
He's been trying to get it changed to the George Smith medal, I think.
Yes,
but,
he's trying.
I think we actually did a bit of work. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and presented. I think we actually did more work together with the Ruper and RA and all that kind of stuff, to be fair, rather than the Brumbies. But it's funny how things evolve a little bit.
Well, Brett, changing topic slightly and on a more serious note, you're being described as a change candidate for the global game, because you are running to become the next World Rugby chairman, and Bill Beaumont's finishing up very shortly. Brett, simple question. What do you think the game needs changing, and how might you be able to help and be part of that solution?
Well, I think it's really important to sort of answer the question about, what is the role of the chair of World Rugby and what is the role of a chair, and sort of hone in on that, and for the organisation and for the game, what for now are the skills, capabilities, and requirements of that role. And I guess when I was asked by colleagues to consider running for the role, there were things that they could see in me that could be helpful to where the game is at. And I guess if I look at, World Rugby has been around a long time with this great global game, which in Australia I don't think as many people understand as we do, as passionate rugby players who can see that. But this game, at an organisational level, the World Rugby sort of kicked off in 1886 and was effectively responsible for laws, regulations, and signing off on an annual calendar up until 1987. And at that point, it decided, because of some really bright guys in the Southern Hemisphere, in New Zealand and Australia, coming up with this principle, well, why don't we host a World Cup every 4 years, similar to the Olympics? And that meant a significant shift for what role World Rugby played, and also its role in developing and building the game, because suddenly revenues were being created by this governing body that enabled it to fund so many things. And, we're 35, 40 years on, and the organisation has significantly shifted through the professional years to now be at a point where it's making decisions now over the next 10 years around not just men's World Cups, but women's World Cups. So we've got, England next year, Australia in 27 men's, Australia 29 women's, 31 USA men's, 33 women's. We run a sevens tournament that now, again, I was fortunate to be at the Olympic Games a month or so ago, where we had, 550,000 people come through the gates over 6 days. On one day, both the men's and women's, we emptied the stadium and refilled it to have 130,000 people watch those tournaments. So it's a magnificent vehicle for growing our game and participation in emerging nations, but also for our women's product as well. We're funding and supporting women's competitions around the world. We're investing heavily in safety and welfare, 40 to 50 million pounds over the next 4 years to implement instrumented mouth guards that can real time track G-forces in players' heads in every professional tournament in the world. So the organisation is significantly different to what it was. And if we look forward over the next sort of 7 to 8 years, it's going to need to transform again. So Australia, the projected surpluses out of the Rugby World Cup in Australia are 550 million pounds. For the US tournament, 700 million pounds. That's an enormous commercial responsibility. And I think that the leadership approach of that chair, in someone that's contemporary and player focused, someone that's commercially driven, someone that's going to drive and set the tone and the culture of the organisation, and someone that has the commitment and the energy, is going to be mission critical. So whether that's me or it's someone else, I think they're the things that the organisation and the members should be considering as it makes that decision.
Brett, do you see yourself as, in a sense, uniquely placed as an Australian, someone who's been involved in the game, very hands-on in Australia? And if you look at the game worldwide, rugby's doing, pretty well. Whereas if you look in Australia, we have these unique challenges, we have significant challenges, and being at the coalface and dealing with that, do you see yourself as maybe ahead of the game in the sense of the European counterparts, that you kind of are seeing where like some trends are heading and where the potential pitfalls are?
Yeah, look, I think there's two parts to that, Matty. I mean, the first thing is, I have a deep love and care for our sport. Like, I grew up in Toowoomba, learned to play the game with some really close friends of mine that became rock stars around the world, Tim Horan, Jason Little, Garrick Morgan, and others, and came to Brisbane, played as an amateur for half of my career and half of my career as a professional, as a medic myself, I got sort of, deeply focused on the elements of our game close to concussion, safety, welfare, but also developed a deep passion for how the sport may operate off the field as well through early days post-retirement, after I did some time in Oxford studying at the university there and playing there, to come back to the Rugby Australia in the early 2000s and lead the high performance unit through the World Cup in 2003, when the game in Australia was really thriving. So I went through a period of tremendous success on the field and also off the field through those early years, and I guess have stayed connected and passionate about the sport, both as an administrator but also as a father. I've got two boys that played in the UQ second grade grand final last Saturday and got belted by brothers, which kills us all, and I'm a magpie. And to have Tom and Will play together, Tom's a Colt, Will's playing his first year out of Colt, so they both ran on together. My daughter Eloise plays sevens rugby for King's College at UQ, and they've won the title this year of the university sevens competition. And I'm involved in some concussion research with University of Queensland, so I'm deeply involved in the sport independently of what skills I might bring. But to your point, Natty, Australia's like, I've used this word, it's the canary in the coal mine in terms of what is changing around the world. And structurally, we've always had some challenges. We've also had the most competitive football environment in the world. And the things that we see here are often well ahead of when things may be occurring around the world. And we know that, one of the great challenges for us is this tension around the economics of the game and the global macroeconomics of revenue versus cost. And one of the great pressures we have is wage inflation pressures not being supported by revenue that we can create. And there are things we can do around revenue, and we can talk about the Nations Championship, which I think is a wonderful thing that the game can't walk away from again after it walked away from it in the last cycle. We have to embrace that opportunity to really maximise the revenue opportunity for the game for Tier 1 nations, but also for Tier 2 nations. There's 24 teams that are mixed up in this project that's mission critical. But the other important piece is, how do we enable sustainable foundational systems to occur within member unions around the world that allow their clubs and their schools and their pathways to connect to their international competition model. And that's really being fractured at the moment, because we have a talent pool and a base of players that the salaries of those players are blowing up our club structures provincially around the world and putting pressures all around the world, whether that be in the Premiership, in the URC, whether it be in Africa, it's domestic competition in South America, and here in Australia. We've had to just, unfortunately, Matty, again, let a team go. They've let 3 go in the Premiership. The Welsh are under real pressure to let a team go. So it's something the game has to address to enable us to be sustainable. And to your point, that's something that we see here earlier than others. And I think the other key element that we see earlier here is the need for change around the product. Our competitors of AFL and Rugby League can, on a weekend, realise something needs to be fixed, and they can fix it quite quickly. Our system doesn't enable that to happen as quickly. That being said, we recently had a big conference post-World Cup in Dublin with players, referees, administrators, broadcasters, to talk about the things that were really annoying our fans and to address them. And those things that were annoying our fans, where we kicked the ball too much and senselessly, we didn't promote the attacking team to maintain possession in the football, and we had too much dead time. So then we said, well, what are we going to do about that? So we set up some working groups. We introduced some more trials. There are things that we have done, I think, through the championship and in recent windows to start to introduce shot clocks and pushing, if there's no contest in the line out, let's play on. If it's a short arm from a scrum, let's not have another scrum. Let's look at, and the one thing that I think is still frustrating me a little bit through the championship is these delays that are directly linked to players that may seek help or seek medical support, and the slowing down of the game through that. But broadly, I think some of those things there have been attempts to address it, but my challenge back to us is, can we do more? Can we do it faster? But I think there are encouraging signs.
Yeah, I think the shape of game stuff is very interesting. I've been encouraged by the start of the rugby championship. There's obviously ways to go, but one thing I've always and a lot of the comments about rugby is it's quite a conservative game in that sense. And if you look at strategically we're going to Australia for the next World Cup, and then we're going to America. You know, it almost seems like a conservative decision versus a really out there, progressive, forward-seeking way. How do you see that going? How do you see World Rugby breaking into that new tier or that new market, which for so long has felt like it's promised a lot, or we've felt like, you know, it's the way to go. How do you see that eventuating? What are the key things that we must get right to capitalize on it?
Well, I think it's a great question because, you know, sort of the key platforms for what I think are important around financial sustainability, growing key markets, having competitions that support and enable our members, growing our fans and our players through product, shape of the game, as well as welfare, and then having a really focused organisation. And the decision was taken actually last cycle to say, rather than get caught up in a 4-year cycle of decision making, let's take a long-term view. Let's take a view that enables us to build a sustainable plan to get an outcome. And so Australia was seen to be a core market. You know, we have wonderful venues. We have amazing opportunities to deliver high quality environments for high quality product. We know that we can do that. We've done it before. So World Rugby supported bringing the next men's and women's games to what we would describe as a safer market. That being said, there's a lot of work to do, but Australia will see it next year with the Lions. You know, people love to come to Australia. Australia is a wonderful destination for particularly UK tourists to save up a lifetime to come to a tournament and spend months here. And we've seen that in 2003. We'll see it next year, and we'll see it in 27. But then we've said to ourselves that we need to de-risk the organisation and the sport, because we're so dependent upon the European market. UK and France are 60 to 70% of the global rugby economy, and we can only grow those markets so much more. And in the best interest of the whole game, we need to expand key markets. And one of those key markets is North America, but we needed some time to build to that platform. And we have no doubt that taking a World Cup to the US will be successful commercially. We believe we can deliver that. Fans will come, great matches will be played, it'll be a wonderful experience. But the real question is, how much more do we invest in high performance outcomes for the US men's and women's teams to deliver those teams in the environment? You could see in Japan, having the Japanese go deep through the tournament is really important for not only the tournament, but for the legacy of the game. We have very, very much a different view of the women's game. The women's game in North America, as you could see from the sevens to our, unfortunately, those of us that weep for our girls who, you know, are world champions in our hearts, weren't at the Olympics. It wasn't their day. But to have the Canadians and the Americans on the podium is an example of the strength of the North American women's platforms. And if you watch the WXV, you know that those guys are also incredibly strong. But it's probably the men's platform that we have to make some considered choices about how much we think we should or shouldn't invest in those guys to deliver that outcome.
Brett, can you tell me about your reaction last week when reports have been around for a while, haven't they, about New Zealand and South Africa getting closer? But when a decision like that occurs, and then Rugby Australia and the Wallabies and perhaps Argentina, the Pumas, how do they feel about it? Because it seems like the rich are getting a little bit richer there and the poor perhaps getting a little bit poorer. And what does it mean from a World Rugby perspective about trying to grow the global game, but you're seeing a couple of countries, perhaps, you know, almost in a India, England, Australia, cricket kind of test cricket kind of areas where, yeah, the rich are getting richer and perhaps the poor are getting sidelined a little bit more?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good question. There's this element of what are the things World Rugby can influence and control, and what sits within the hands of the unions and their competition owners. So obviously Six Nations, the Rugby Championship, SANZAR are all independent of World Rugby, and World Rugby has a role to play in facilitating and coordinating, but ultimately doesn't have direct lines of control over those events. So I guess the focus is, for us, from our perspective, has been to embed the principle of the Nations Championship across the game, and then for the markets to determine in between times what they think works for them. So it's probably something more for Phil to talk to than me directly. But we are motivated to see, I guess, the importance and the sanctity of the international game being protected. The World Cup is the sort of pinnacle of that. We see that the Nations Championship will within those cycles create another platform for significant revenue growth, and I think something that's meaningful for fans. And then this connection to the second tier of promotion relegation enables us to really build out the second tier of competition, so that when we bring 24 teams to Australia, so you might remember we've expanded Australia from 20 to 24 teams, we're going to have 4 more teams that are competing on the global stage, and the Nations Championship is a critical path to giving them the competition environment that they need to be as successful and as competitive as they possibly can. So I think where we can sort of coordinate, but ultimately those decisions sit, as they rightfully do, for the owners of their teams and their competitions. And I know Phil's thinking about, well, what else can Australia do in those fallow years to set up something as compelling? I know that there's a great piece of work that's being announced that is setting up a third Bledisloe test as a part of an Anzac round, which I think is a wonderful principle. New Zealand have agreed to support, the taking of a weekend to Perth, where all the super teams play minus their All Blacks and Wallabies. The Wallabies and the Wallaroos play over 4 days, in addition to or possibly in addition to the additional games that they have. So I think it's up to each of the nations to work through that. But I understand your point, and I can understand how that could be, viewed.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time. But the financial sustainability piece that you were talking about before with the clubs as well, even right now at present, I think that there's actually a international transfer fee that can be applied, but very few teams actually take it up because it's just not.
Yeah.
It's not being policed. Can you tell me a little bit more about how sides might be able to take advantage of it, and how that fits in terms of the financial sustainability piece? Because it definitely affects the Pacific Island sides, the Australia and New Zealand, who are losing so many to Japan and to France especially.
Yeah, look, World Rugby has always had the couple of sort of critical levers that are available to us about protecting the international game. One is Regulation 9, which is the release windows that clubs have to abide by in terms of access to international players and the international windows. The other is the release and compensation arrangements that basically enable unions to seek compensation for development and investment into individual players, which, to be frank, the game hasn't really ever followed through on. So we have, I think I might have caught up with you, Christy, when you were up in Brisbane a few weeks ago. This has got to a point where we've got a crisis meeting that we're holding in the back end of September, where all of the Tier 1 CEOs and chairs are coming to Dublin for us to actually talk about, this is a real issue, but for us to do something about it, we all have to agree on what does that look like, because there's tension here. There's tension of ownership, of club, country, province. How does that all line up with your pathways and holding players? We have other sports like rugby league and AFL that are attacking us, but there are things that UEFA use. There are tools in other sports that they actually use to try and support compensation, but also to put pressure on how player movement might be managed or at least compensated for. And I just don't think we've been serious about that. So if we're serious about it, if we think it's a big enough problem, which we think it is, we actually need to agree. And then World Rugby's job then to set up a proper resource and a mechanism to deal with that. Or is that something that the international unions manage themselves? But we just haven't ever invested the infrastructure and the policies and procedures at a detail where they're binding people and driving the outcomes that we all need. Because if we don't address it, the structural challenges that we've seen here in Australia, where the sort of ongoing upward pressure on salary caps is just ultimately going, and it's, I'm all for players doing well. I was a founding member of RUPA back in my day, and was deeply involved in the CBA negotiations the first time and the second time. So I understand that we have wonderful industrial relations frameworks, I think, in Australia compared to anywhere in the world, that we need to protect. But I do think there's this piece where once you start to get the inflationary pressures on wages that are being driven by philanthropic monies that aren't sustainable, you end up toppling. And when we topple, we lose teams, and we lose players, and we lose livelihoods, and it's incredibly destructive. So I think it's something that if we best we can, and I know the Premiership have been looking at this, they've looked at ways of trying to manage this, but you do need to, there's a whole body of people and policy that need to be behind it to have some teeth to cut through and make sure it happens.
Brett, as a sports fan myself, and you mentioned UEFA and football and particularly golf more recently, you see the interests of like Saudi money. How much of a I want to say threat, but how much of a temptation, or what is that conversation like within rugby? Has it been explored yet? Has there been conversations? Or I know something was rejected recently, but is it realistic with rugby? Is rugby a big enough sport?
I think what you're alluding to is the interest from Qatar of investing in the Nations Championship, and I think some unions in the North particularly's views on that. All I would say is, where the source of capital comes from, etc., is something for everyone to consider. But what I'm really not keen to see is that a concept falls over because people aren't prepared to step in, because there were other issues, not just the capital source, but also sharing of rights and what distributions would. So it's actually sitting behind it was also a commercial negotiation amongst unions about what they think they should be paid as a split of that. And I think it's really important that we get going. And the worst thing we can do is stall and balk and not do anything, because, as we all know, if you're 80% there in life, if you can kick on and get moving with something, you'll find a way to work through those issues. There'll be more value lost. Like if you go back and look at the value we've destroyed by not getting on with this 4 years ago or 5 years ago, we're losing time. And I just think that the minds, and I believe that they are looking to find a way to get there because they understand that. But I think it's important that we find a way, acknowledging that there are obviously issues that certain unions had with where the sourcing of the capital came from. But if that wasn't the source and it was another source and it was a lesser number, I think getting going will create value in the long term for everybody.
Well, Brett, we could talk for a lot longer. You are running to be the first man from the Southern Hemisphere since 1996 to be chairman of World Rugby. So it's a remarkable thing.
I don't think there's ever been anyone. I don't think there's been anyone. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it has. Check
the Wikipedia again. 1886.
Well, it does seem like that. You've got three competitors: John Jeffrey. There's a new competitor coming out of France. Italy has got someone as well. So it's not necessarily a shoe-in by any stretch of the imagination that you will be. But from an Australian perspective, what would it do for Southern Hemisphere rugby and Australia to have someone like yourself be at the top of the international governing body?
Look, I think the first thing is to say this is not a hemisphere issue. These things I'm describing to you are global issues. And I think that the important thing for all the members to think about, whether it's me or any of the other candidates, is to go back to the job description, really understand what it is you need in the role, and look to drill hard into each of us as to whether we're the right person to deliver what the game needs. And if the process does that, then whoever it is, I have the confidence will deliver what's in the best interest of the global game. And that includes ultimately what's good for Australia, because the things that we've discussed tonight are consistently ours as they are. Bill Sweeney, who I'm quite close to from the RFU, described it. The existential threat we have in our game is losing connection with our younger generation, which are our kids, my kids who are just out of school and at university. And if we're not adapting around the product that we're delivering and creating a safe environment to do it, then we're going to lose them, because there's so much, it's fascinating to watch what the NFL do, what the NBA do, how they attack my boys at every possible channel to try and grab their attention. And then what are we doing to try and compete with that as equally? Because we do have a wonderful game. I mean, Maddie, you and I have had the great joy of traveling the world because of it. Christy, you have the great joy of supporting it and commentating on it over many years around the world. It's something I think that the values of our sport, what it gives you on and off the field for the rest of your life, is pretty special. So I think this role is a really important one to make sure that we don't miss the opportunities that we have in front of us over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's pretty evident that rugby does require that kind of progressive thinking. So from our part, yeah, we be awesome if we had someone like you or someone who thinks that way, because yeah, the game it's changing, and it's vastly different from when we well, even when I played, but when we played and when a lot of these rules or structures were all set up, it's a moving landscape.
Yeah, no, thanks guys. Thanks for your support too, hey, and thanks for what
Well,
you do for our.
yeah, it's great to have you, Brett, and appreciate your time. And it's a huge balancing act, especially with the emergence of women's rugby, especially over the last decade or so. And we've just seen, with England and what they've done to promote women's rugby is just immense in the 15-person game. We've seen it in sevens as well. So it's a huge juggling act, and good luck for in a couple of months' time when these decisions and the votes are cast. So thanks again for coming on the World Rugby podcast. That was an interesting and insightful discussion there with Brett Robinson. Really great to have him on, and do pay attention to what happens later in the year, because it certainly could influence how rugby on the international stage, but even domestically, how it could shape up. So awesome to have Brett come on the pod.
Yeah, it was awesome to chat to him, and it was funny actually at the start. You said you talk about us shaking hands and whatnot. My last Brett Robinson award day, what do you call it? I know this isn't this is a different type of podcast show, but I will share a little bit of a story. But it was 2016, and so I was finishing up at the Brumbies, and Christian Lealifano he'd been diagnosed with cancer the year before, and he had missed a lot of the season and all that, and that year, sorry. So he'd just gone through his first round of chemotherapy, and I flew down for the Brett Robinson Award. I went to go see Christian, had my suit and everything ready, and I was like, all right, you ready to go? And he goes, I'm not going. I said, why not? And he goes, oh, mate, I'm just going to be that cancer guy there. Like, everyone's going to be annoyed, like he's just come off. And he goes, and my doctor said I'm allowed to have a beer. So I said, all right, well, we're not going. So we didn't go to the Brett Robinson. We stayed at Christian's house, had a few beverages, needless to say. And the next morning I was flying up to Brisbane to present jerseys to Brisbane State High, who ironically Jordan Patai was playing for at the time, but I was presenting jerseys to them, and I hadn't had a wink of sleep. And I'd been getting calls all night saying, your farewell speech, you're up, like you got to come. And I was like, I'm not here, blah, 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 blah. Anyways, I get on the flight in the morning, haven't had a wink of sleep at 6:30 in the morning. Who's sitting next to me? Brett Robinson. The awards, the person the award is named after, who I've just snubbed the night before, and he's talking about the shape of the game, and I'm not in a state, Like, I'm not in a state. I was, oh yeah, and trying to hold the best poker face I could. So I'm not sure if he remembers that, because I certainly do, and oh my God, that was nerve wracking. But I always get a little bit nervous every time I talk to him now. I'm like, does he know about it? Yeah. Anyway, cool. Anyways, story for another podcast, maybe.
7 or 8 years, you finally had that catch-up discussion on the state of the game.
Yeah, eventually. But that wasn't exactly the time or place. But interesting. And hey, it's cool seeing, it's cool seeing that we're still very much in the conversation worldwide for the game and the way the game's moving. So best of luck to him, and I'm sure he can do some wonders.
Oh, look, it's a really pivotal moment in time for the global game, because I just think that the decision for New Zealand and South Africa to have inbound tours and mean that the Rugby Championship's only going to be played biannually rather, every second year. That's a mind-blowing decision. I think that we've got the Six Nations that played every year, the TRC to be played every second year. It's just strange more than anything, but I don't think that'll help the relevance of rugby. It's going to mean it's chaotic. How's the public, who's the casual fan, going to understand? Well, I thought the TRC was on this year. It reminds me of Super Rugby when it expanded to 18 teams a little bit, and people were here, there, and everywhere.
Yeah. I went to a Shape of Game thing recently with Super Rugby Sansa a couple of years ago, and they were talking about like the way the game's going and what we're competing against, and they put up a poster of the Kardashians and basically saying, like, this is who you're competing against. And it was interesting, and I know it's not that overt, but we need to start realizing that it has to be entertaining for the people watching it at home. You know, like we can't, like, yes, we have traditions and all this kind of stuff. Yes, we have the Tri-Nations, which was amazing, into TRC, but it's moving. It's a dynamic landscape, and we need to be proactive in that area, because otherwise we're going to just fall away into insignificance. You look at it, something like a UFC, like the way that they've evolved their kind of business model in a time where we're talking about concussion crippling our game. Somehow the UFC is as popular as anything, probably more so than rugby at the moment. So we need some forward thinking. We need to be a little bit risky, and I think it seems like Brett is uniquely placed in the sense that he has seen the kind of the temptations or the challenges that the game faces here locally, and as he says, that canary in the coal mine.
Well, just to put a bow on that TRC discussion, I think the proactiveness that they missed out was in 2019 when Japan just didn't come into the TRC. Like, that was the moment in time to seize the moment. And I know I've spoken about it for probably 3 or 4 years. I used to ask Andy Marinos every presser, what's happening with Japan? And even a year ago, asking Phil Waugh. And yeah, I think that moment has looked like it's just passed a little bit. And that's a shame, because I think it's a bit stale, the TRC. I don't think it's perfect, but it's a competition that people know is happening every year. So until they can find something like that, or freshen it up, jazz it up, I think it's just going to struggle to have that relevance and that emotional attachment to it. We'll save more of that discussion for a later time when we find out more. But on the ABs and the Springboks, another titanic clash between a couple of titans of the game, 18-12. And look, that was, we saw the free running nature of them a week ago in Johannesburg, didn't we? But we saw how tight, how physical these two sides are when they go toe to toe.
Yeah, hopefully our mate Barnes is writing about the All Blacks attack and how much it's struggling, as he did for us. But no, look, what a game. What a genuine game, a genuine test match. But still exciting. Yeah, there weren't as many tries, but it was still a very open game. It was extremely physical. It was, I think, two of the top 3 teams for sure in the world at the moment, playing really well. I feel for Scott Robinson a little bit. He's had a little bit of a tough start, down the bottom end of the table. But look, I think they're not as badly placed as it might feel in Auckland at the moment. I think they've played some really, really good rugby. It's interesting times for New Zealand rugby, because he was the hero this time last year, wasn't he?
No, he certainly was. So he's kind of going to quickly lose his hair if he has those sorts of encounters on a weekly basis. But I thought Cody Taylor, just immense. Satiti, the new back rower from the Chiefs, doesn't he just look like an absolute baller? And the physicality that he's already showing is just through the roof. I want to ask you about Cheslin Colby, because he's just a guy that continues to blow my mind. Like, he was denied a try, but a brilliant last-ditched effort there from Sam Cane. But how good is he? He can just beat someone in a phone booth.
Yeah, and he's speaking then to Brett about the game and the way it's evolving and the role of sevens. And you look at like a guy like Cheslin Colby, and he epitomizes rugby and its evolution, and it done well and embraced well. Yeah, this is a guy who's throwing lineouts, a guy who's feeding scrums, a guy who's taking a drop kick to push the game. Like, this is a guy who kicks goals as well. Like, he is just this. We don't know what to, we can't put him in a box. And if we did, he'd step us. But he genuinely is just an amazing thing. And like I said, I think he epitomizes the way the game is going, and when it's done well, when it's embraced well, because we're not saying, mate, stand your wing and beat it. We're saying, why can't you throw a line out if they're only got 6 in the line out and we get all of our forwards in there? Like, there's all this, fascinating kind of way the game's going. I think he very much is at the pointy end of it.
I know that he didn't play on the weekend, but seeing how Colby, a small guy, just be able to influence the game like he does. Curtly Aronson is another one who's only 80 kilograms. He's only made his test debut, I think last year. It might have been in 22, but definitely was featuring in 23. He's a 28-year-old, and he wasn't thrown into the international scene as a 20-year-old, as a 19-year-old, like what we're seeing with Max Jorgensen. So it's a fascinating, the development and how South Africa are managing to have their players play the game, but they're bringing him, they're injecting him in at the right stages of their career. And Colby wasn't rushed in. He played years of Super Rugby and in the Seven Circuit before he became a regular Springbok too. So I like what they're doing. South Africa in 2016 had 50 points put on them by the All Blacks in 2016. They then got pumped, I think, 57-0 a year later in New Zealand. They ended up winning the World Cup in 2019. They did sack a coach along the way with Rassie Erasmus coming. No one's going to be calling for Joe Schmidt to be sacked, but things can turn. Decisive decisions and action needs to take place. I just wonder, and maybe we close on this, but a thought from you to finish off. What's the proactive step that Rugby Australia needs to do to ensure that the Wallabies in the coming years are competitive?
It's I've made it quite known on this. I love Rassie. I love the way he thinks at the moment. I think he leads the game. At that time, he spoke about it's not going to be a tactical thing on field. It's going to be a structural change. And, for him, it was very much they had transformation. They have all these other things to deal with. But it was that, their version of the ghetto law. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's our solution, but it clearly is a structural change that is needed, rather than our guys need to get in the gym a little bit more. Like, everyone's trying their hardest. We've got high performance programs. All these are, they're as good as anyone else's in the world. But there's something else that needs to change structurally with the way the game is. I don't necessarily mean governed. I don't think we're as fortunate as the South Africans in the sense that we can just open the borders up and then we'll win the World Cup. But it's going to have to be a lasting structural change for any kind of meaningful result, I think.
I think we need to see some of those plans. They might not necessarily come to fruition, but I think we need to hear what is being planned, because people have been saying there's a plan for a little while. There's a lot of people scratching their head going, well, what's next? Because at the moment, it does seem like we're slipping further and further behind. So a really interesting discussion with Brett Robinson earlier. Perhaps the international transfer fees is a solution that can help bring more money into the Australian back pockets to perhaps retain the talent, to be able to ensure that you can chase the next generation coming through the school levels. But some really big questions on the horizon for Australian rugby that they need to deal with. Awesome to have you, Matt, on the pod as always. That was good fun, and let us know week next one. So I can't wait for that.